All right. Thank you very much again for coming, everyone. We always appreciate your attendance at our seminar series. Today we have our July speaker, Paula Motta. Just by way of introduction, Anna is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Pre- and Protohistoric Archaeology at Kiel University, conducting work supported by the Gerda Henkel Foundation. She has a dual background in anthropology and archaeology, with work bridging multi-species archaeology, indigenous studies, and decolonial theory. Having previously worked at Balangara, in Balangara country in Australia, examining identity and the role of animals in indigenous rock art, she's currently exploring relationships between humans and jaguars in the Brazilian Pantanal. We're very grateful to have her here today to give her talk entitled Animal Encounters, Multispecies Ethnographies, and Indigenous Ecological Knowledge Systems. Thank you very much, Paula. Anna, please take it away.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Yes, so I'm going to be presenting today about work that I have done previously in the Kimberley in Australia related to rock art research, but also my ongoing research with the colonial theories and human-animal relations in the Pantanal in Brazil.
And walkabouts and so on.
Sorry? Yeah, for those of you, I'm sorry, who, I don't know why this is jumping through, but hopefully it's fine now. So for those of you that are not familiarized with my work, as this is my first time presenting, so a bit of my background, I did my bachelor's in Argentina, where I work with hunter-gatherer occupations in the northwestern part and doing stable isotopes analysis in camelids. But I also work in historic archaeology or urban archaeology, and then for my master's, I work with Upper Paleolithic excavations in southern France, and also recording some engravings also in southern France. And then I went to Australia to do my PhD in Kimberley rock art and human-animal relations, and continue my work on human-jaguar relationships in Brazil mostly, but I'm also working in Bolivia and some parts of Colombia. So this presentation, sorry, I don't know what's happening. If it's the sharing, because it's not letting me move between slides, just one at a time. So first of all, I would like to start my presentation with this quote from one of my favorite science fiction writers, Ursula Le Guin, which summarizes my presentation today. So this quote appears near the end of the Wizard of Earthsea novel. This is the first of the saga, if you haven't read this. And the main protagonist, Jed, has woken up from a coma-like state by a creature called Otak, who became his friend and protector throughout this book. So Jed learns at this part of the book that all living things can teach us something, no matter if they have speech or not in the Western sense. And in order to become wise, he dedicates the rest of his life in silence, learning from what's around him and other creatures. So how can this be related to my presentation today? So mostly I'm going to engage with different discourses related to human-animal encounters and challenge deep-rooted assumptions about human nature and categorical distinctions between humans and animals that are mostly dominated by a colonial gaze. Again, so I'm going to reshare my screen again. I don't know what's the problem with this. If that's all right, I'm going to leave the presentation as it is like that. I hope you can see it properly, especially the text. But I don't know what's the problem with the PowerPoint. So yes, basically in anthropology, there's been different views on how to study animals, mostly separated into three different trends. The first one being good to survive, or good to eat, good to think, and good to live with. The first of these three lines of inquiry, good to survive or good to eat. It's mostly related to different approaches in anthropology, archaeology, and biology that understands animals as having an economic value linked to domestication and the study of animal behavior or ethology. The second of these ones was coined by Levi-Strauss in the 60s, and it's basically understanding the symbolic value of animals and studying totemism and animism. While the third one, Animals as Good to Live With, it's about animal communication, post-domestication, and new ethological approaches to the study of animals. So in the last 3 decades, there's been a shift on how we perceive animals in the social sciences, and it's been mostly brought over by the development of the animal turn in the 90s and the incorporation of relational approaches in anthropology and beyond. So it's not only concerned with subsistent and symbolic practices of animals, but it's also recognizing that animals are sentient beings that engage with human populations, and these are mutually constitutive. The second of these, some of these trends in anthropology have also translated into archaeology, and it follows the same development. However, in the public imagination, archaeology is mostly associated with these romantic images of excavations in exotic and remote places, uncovering ancient artifacts, structures, and tombs, and the discovery of lost civilizations. And this was particularly the case during the 19th century, in which archaeology became a facilitator for the establishment of deep antiquity of the world, and especially humanity. And these processes were centered particularly in Europe and North America. So archaeology was influenced by contemporary understandings of human diversity within the framework of European imperialism, racism, and colonialism. So perspectives coming from the global south have often been neglected by the global north, except in the last decade, I will say. So such examples, like for example, the work of Luis Guillermo Vasco Uribes, that bring forward different ways of understanding temporality in terms of linear terms, and reinterpret them as concentric movement or the movement of a snail, as we can see in this image have. So while archaeology has followed the same division of animals as in anthropology, as good to eat, good to think with, and good to live with, the first two of these three have been mostly having worked extensively in archaeology. So I'm going to focus on the last of these 3 lines of thought. So while there's been an increasing interest in incorporating multi-species methodologies and different ontologies in archaeology, there's been little problematization of archaeology's assumptions on how different species perceive the world. So that's something I'm trying to do for my postdoc research at the moment. So why talk about animals and human-animal entanglements then? So in this sense, I think archaeology from the end of the 1980s up to nowadays, we have in a way problematized what makes us human, what makes an animal, but particularly in rock art studies. So the question is not to define what animals are, but to reflect on the affective capacities that animals have and what's the effect on human-animal relations. So this is in a way being dragged from the 19th century Enlightenment, in which humans are placed above other species and at the center of knowledge. And it's based on human exceptionalism, in which humans are seen as superior as other non-human beings. So in this trend, nature and culture are seen as separate, for example. But it's also interesting the work that Ingold conducted in terms of animality and humanity, as we can see in the image on the right. So even though the study of human populations have been central in anthropology and archaeology specifically, before the animal turn in the 90s, there's been an increasing interest for studying non-humans and multi-species scholarships. So Ingold, as I mentioned, suggests that notions of humanity and animality have been conceptualized as twofold. On the one hand, animality is seen as a domain that includes human beings, but on the other hand, it's also conceived as a condition that excludes other beings. So these two notions of humanity or culture versus animality or nature have been extensively discussed. However, it's central to understanding how animals and humans have been conceptualized in social sciences and beyond. With the advent of the animal turn, also the ontological turn, there's been reconceptualization of human exceptionalism to include cosmocentric or ecocentric perspectives instead, in which animals are part and humans as well are part of multi-species dwelling landscapes and not located at the center. So it displaces humans above all other species. However, in archaeology, the advancement of post-colonial and decolonial perspectives is not happening at the same pace as other disciplines. So it's my focus in this presentation to also present different ways of how we can reflect on our own research through a decolonial lens. So in archaeology, for example, the work of Chris Cosden argues that archaeology play a major role in reproducing colonial discourses that position Europe as the birthplace of humanity or different technological developments, and as a lens of interpreting the past. So while research developments have increased the diversity of theoretical frameworks, the study of non-humans still continues to be somehow rooted in different assumptions about human nature and nature in general, and distinctions between humans and non-human actors. So in the last 10 years, I will say, even though multi-species studies have developed in other disciplines much earlier than in archaeology, in the last 10 years, there's been a proliferation or an interest for multi-species studies. So despite this increasing interest, there's still work to be done in terms of methodological developments and theoretical developments and how this can be applied to archaeology. One of these examples is the work of Overton and Hamilakis in 2013, in which they develop a methodology for social archaeology, in which they look into traditional archaeological models instead to reinterpret archaeological or faunal remains from Denmark. So how can we translate this into animals and humans in rock art images? So much of the work we have as rock art researchers is related to the identification of different motifs in the rock arts. So it's difficult sometimes to apply or to challenge how we understand humans and animals. So I have some examples from a previous paper with Peter Beth and Balangara Aboriginal Corporations onto how we can perhaps redefine our work in rock art. And this is mostly done by a combination of different approaches that I was interested on during my PhD. So even though iconographic analysis of different images was my main research method, I also incorporated methods from other disciplines, such as incorporation of archaeological data from the Kimberley, the study of animal behavior, incorporation of different ethnographies, and also employing multiple correspondence analysis and correspondence analysis into rock art data. So the idea was to move past interpreting rock art images as isolated from other elements, but also to incorporate different different disciplines that also study the same animals and to incorporate that into the interpretations. So the idea was to challenge human and animal categories as being stable throughout time, but also recognizing that this change from different stylistic periods, but also human-animal definitions change as well through time. And also recognizing that some animals contain special significance, and they were not just good to eat, so challenge these menu ideas in rock art that animals were depicted because they were being hunted, but also because they were important for symbolic and different type of ceremonies, and also for everyday life. And this is the example I was talking before from this paper with Peter Beth and Balangara, Regional Corporation, on how to reinterpret human-animal images through a performance approach. So the idea is to recognize that that we can redefine or revise ontological footings of human and animals by looking into body compositions and body postures in the rock art. So what will be traditional identify as a human because it has 2 arms and 2 legs, for example, or it's we challenge this by incorporating also what's the postures, what are these figures doing in the rock art. But that's very briefly. And then how can we translate that, for example, into different illustrations, or how we can use this data to challenge the way animals have been seen in the rock art. So in this slide, we have a particular style called the regular infill animal period. This is the earliest figurative style in the Kimberley with an antiquity between 17 and 13,000 years old, where has majority of figures are corresponding to animals with great anatomical detail, so it's possible to identify to species level and different positions, but are mostly static or resting, or disease in this case. And anthropomorph or human representations are not that common. They are low in frequency, that don't have much anatomical elements, but they also present a lot of convergence with animal and plant elements, as we can see in this figure where we have anthropomorphic figures with macropodals or kangaroo tails, with feet that resemble those of kangaroos as well, and headdresses that look like plantiforms. So the idea is to challenge, like animals are located at the center of representations, they are painted with lots of detail, but there's also animalization of the human body. So in this sense, categories of person were fluid, and there's a lot of overlapping with natural elements. Now, how can we relate this with the coloniality? Sorry. So the colonial approaches in archaeology have a considerable history, I would say. Over the last decades, however, archaeologists have engaged more actively with different elements of wider post-colonial critiques and have explored the consequences of for archaeological theory and practice. So these developments include the archaeological elucidation of European colonialism itself, the establishment of indigenous archaeologies, and the engagement with colonial influences on archaeological analysis and interpretation. However, there's some differences between post-colonial theories and decoloniality itself. While these two share a lot of elements, mostly a criticism of modernity and its links to colonialism, there's different influences across the two of them. So post-colonialism, for example, is influenced by French post-structuralism and neo-Marxism, and it's been developed in former colonies of the British empires, and most of the outputs have been done in English. And they're also interested in studying the dichotomies between the oppressors and the oppressed. and understanding specifically the experience of colonization itself. So it's looking at the past or looking back, whereas decoloniality is grounded mostly on theory produced in Latin America across different languages and perspectives, although I will say that the majority of the outputs are also done in Spanish, which is another colonial language. And it's also interested in the deconstruction on modern apparatuses and institutions, particularly universities. So it's a way of moving forward. In this sense, there's a lot of different authors. One of the most prominent ones is Mignolo, Walter Mignolo, but there's other researchers like Aníbal Quijano that greatly influenced Mignolo, and Enrique Dussel, and for example, Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, who criticizes Mignolo a lot, and she brings forward an indigenous perspective into decoloniality. And there's a lot of volumes being produced across Latin America on these topics. But overall, many have argued that decolonizing is a means of exposing systemic violence perpetrated by Eurocentric epistemologies, or is a way of disassociating oneself from Western epistemologies, like Mignolo have argued. Others have used the term decolonial, for example, to open a dialogue between different worlds, or as a way of walking or performance, or a way of disrupting hegemonic and colonial power. So walking in this context refers to the performativity of knowledge production, where the world is known by experiencing, walking, or dwelling in it, thus recreating connections between people, landscapes, and beings. So this notion of walking highlights different ways in which coloniality is enacted and further reproduced during the research process. Sorry. Then, how can we apply decolonizing perspectives into human-animal studies? Some have argued that decolonial perspectives are not that much present within animal studies, but if we look into environmental humanities, that's not the case. There's a lot of work that has been done within this sphere. So decolonial approaches have recognized long ago that animal and the animal bodies are constructed in opposition to humanity and human bodies. So animals were traditionally seen as part of nature, so they were seen as colonial subjects, or their bodies were seen as sites of commodification, food production, and companionship. Animality then is not restricted to animals, but is further extended as well to non-white people and different bodies. So through this logic, racialized people of color and colonized subjects are also conceptualized as hybrid beings along a gradient between full humanity and full animality. So animality becomes that allows and justifies exploitation. So decoloniality then opens a dialogue across the South, threading outside Western knowledge centers. So these non-Western knowledges see the world as being relational, as the case proposed by Paz Valentina Donoso Miranda, in which she proposes these geographies of reason, or to rethink geographies of reason. So while Mignolo and other authors focus on understanding decoloniality as the other phase of modernity, indigenous perspectives bring forward multi-species entanglements. Thus, engaging with multi-species archaeologies, along with the incorporation of a decolonial lens, allow us to further move from traditional appreciations of non-European others, where both non-humans and indigenous people are conceptualized as being closer to nature. So, according to some authors, animals are not just emerging as activations, but also as capable of creating kinship relations with humans and other animals. In this sense, we have, for example, different examples on how animals and others the local dependence to local dependency of knowledge production and to the symmetrical and non-hierarchical engagement with people, animals, and other actors. So recent literature in environmental history and human geography has also adopted a specifically multi-species orientation to center humanity in past and present narratives. So in this case, the conceptualization of animals, humans, and their interaction is related to multi-species justice in negotiations about environmental challenges. And in this sense, we have the development of multi-species ethnographies in environmental humanities and beyond, and these are slowly being incorporated into anthropology and archaeological research as well, and this is something I'm trying to do on my postdoctoral research, but some of the, I will say, most prolific researchers are Ivan Kirksey, who published in 2016 and then 2010 as well, different reflections on multi-species studies, and I believe he's among the researchers that coined the term multi-species studies in environmental humanities, but there's other researchers such as Michaela Fenske in Germany, focus on storytelling. We have Natasha Fishing and Andrea Petit, and they have this establishing this school of research on multi-species ethnography and artful methods of multi-species studies and sensing methodologies. So these are some of the researchers to start with, I will say, for multi-species ethnographies. And how will this translate into my own research? So the idea is to combine different perspectives to try to understand human jaguar engagements in South America and how these have changed throughout time. So while for this research, I'm not using any rock art research or rock art images, I will say, particularly in the case of Brazil, because rock art images tend to be abstract and mostly geometrical. I'm incorporating or experimenting with different methodologies to expand human jaguar perception. So while I'm using archaeological data derived from literature studies to see how jaguar representations change from the past and particularly to the present through. I'm also looking into other ways of conducting fieldwork, mostly conducting interviews, but also doing soundscape recordings and field observations on human-jaguar interactions. So I'm going to be talking now about jaguars and jaguar perceptions in South America, but I'm going to talk about a case study from the Brazilian Pantanal. So this is all applied to the Brazilian Pantanal as well, although jaguars have similar perceptions across the continents. So in general, jaguars have been defined by a multitude of qualities, as I'm going to explain in the next slide, but are one of the most significant animals in South America, and they were considered to be gods associated with rulers, shamans, warriors, and priests. And there's a jaguar corridor in the present day, so jaguars are confined to certain areas. But it's important to say that jaguars have been defined by different qualities across the continent. So what does it mean to be jaguar in South America? So one of the earliest interpretations done on jaguars derived from European or the old world big cats. But being jaguar has a lot of associations to desirable qualities that are connected to rulers, warriors, priests, and shamans. And it's also, being jaguar is a way of being in the world. So jaguars can also be called jaguarete, uturuncu, balam, or ocelotl in different languages in the continent, but they are part of the feline family of Panthera, composed by 8 different species. So big cats play different roles in Western culture and the imagination for many centuries. But over time, this understanding has moved from reflections of real encounters to mere symbols in art and so on. So big cats are generally employed to represent physical power, danger, social dominance, and strength, but this has changed through time as well, and different felines have different behavior. So this translates also differently in archaeology. So as I mentioned, the early interpretations were influenced by the old world big cats. So this perpetuated this idea of jaguars attacking humans. And these comparisons were drawn between jaguars and other Panthera felines that were influenced by colonial attitudes towards these animals, along with the indiscriminate use of 16th century ethnographic theory to interpret pre-classic and classic material culture. And here we have two different images. The one on top is rock art representation of jaguars that have a leash. This is a mirror image from Aguada in northern Argentina. And the image on top is from the Codex Mendoza, in which humans are displayed with a lot of different jaguar paraphernalia. So in Mayan Aztec context, rulers were seen using jaguar masks and headdresses, jaguar skins, claws, and it was a way of transforming oneself into jaguars as well. So at the moment, there's the existence of a jaguar corridor that is linked to biodiversity regions across the continent, in which jaguars can move freely between countries, but there's a precedent for this corridor. So jaguars emerged in Eurasia 6 to 8 million years ago, and then they came to the Americas through the Beringia Bridge between 580 and 260,000 years ago. But the earliest archaeological evidence comes from Schulze Cave in Texas, and it's dated to 11,000 years old, in which we have different layers between jaguars and human remains, although the link between the two is not clear. However, in the past, there also existed this jaguar corridor, but or the Pleistocene corridor, linked to different cultures that share elements regarding jaguar iconography. But the modern day corridor based on biodiversity regions, it's mostly influenced by colonization. So, for example, by the time of European colonization, jaguars became extinct after 100 years in areas of the United States. But in other places, like in Mexico, jaguar populations were being extinguished or displaced due to the overforestation or deforestation of certain areas and large human populations present across these places. But after European colonization, a lot of areas have been recolonized by jaguars. So about human and jaguar entanglements, present day, the deforestation and illegal hunting of jaguars have changed the relationship between humans and these big cats across the entire living range. The loss of ecosystems that drives jaguars to hunt domesticated animals, for example, cattle in the Pantanal case, have led to jaguars being seen as a threat to human living conditions. But there's also a loss of knowledge about jaguars. So in some cases in Mexico, different researchers like Alvarez have studied the conflict between human jaguar populations, and they noted that a lot of young people are moving outside of their traditional villages to go to big cities to pursue education or different job opportunities. So when they go back to visit their families, they don't know how to react if they encounter a jaguar in their town. So that also leads to an increase in jaguar attacks as well, and a change in dynamics. Other examples in which Jaguar perceptions have changed is through the enforced conversion to Catholicism during European colonization, in which Jaguars started to be associated to demonic or satanic rituals rather than be seen as gods. So there's a lot of different ways in which Jaguars have been challenged throughout time. In the case of the Pantanal specifically, there's also a lot of conflict, mostly related to a change to a capitalist mode of subsistence that shifted animals' perceptions. So the Pantanal, 95% of the land is owned by cattle ranchers who see jaguars as a threat because they enter different territories and they attack cattle. But also the Pantanal is an area that generates, as you can see in the slide, a lot of revenue per year. So there's an interest to push tourists coming into this area to see jaguars in their natural or wild environments. So there's different ways in which these tourist companies do that. On the one hand, they practice baiting, feeding practices in which they leave carcasses along the riverbanks for jaguars to come and hunt in a way. So tourists will see jaguars behaving naturally when they come visit. And even some tour operators claim that if you don't see a jaguar within 3 days, you get your money back. So this created a lot of problems, and jaguars being accustomed to human presence. So then jaguars incur into different territories, mostly in the southern Pantanal, in which riverinios or indigenous populations from Wato have a lot of problems with jaguars because they enter into their territories, into their houses, and then they attack their dogs as well as attacks on cattle in other areas. So there's a lot of different elements and layers into jaguar-human conflict in the Pantanal. But as you can see from the picture below, this is it's a big problem because there's a lot of tourists coming into the area, and then there's this conflict between a wild jaguar and a cultural jaguar, in which people come to see jaguars behaving naturally in the wild, but at the other hand, it relies on the humanization of jaguar behaviors or cultural jaguars, so they can see the jaguars in their natural habitats. So I would like to draw attention now how jaguars have defined colonization, because they have survived some of the worst extinction events in the continent, but they also have adapted to different ecosystems. So jaguars in the Pantanal are bigger, for example, than the Amazonian jaguar, even though they are the same species. There is a lot of differences in their weight and their size, for example, and also some of their behaviors. So jaguars are not only, as I have discussed, not only animals, but they also relate to a way of being in the world in which jaguars can see and represent. And here I'd like to draw attention to the work by Eduardo Con, the anthropologist with the Runa people in Ecuador, because according to the Runa, Eduardo Con, when he was working with the Runa, he was informed to sleep facing up, so the jaguar will not see him as a person and will see him as a person and not dead meat. So in this sense, jaguars are capable of recognizing humans as persons and not just as food. So jaguars have this capacity of also seeing us and to be seen as well. So Eduardo Con argues that in these encounters is where transformation occurs. So others become something new, and in this process, we change as well. So in this sense, jaguars do define colonial narratives, and they are seen as an agent of survival and reinvention, because as I mentioned before, with the case of the Mesoamerica in Mexico, for example, jaguars recolonize areas that were previously occupied by humans. And this is interesting for rethinking human and jaguar futures and to ask ourselves how can we learn from jaguars about resilience. So I have discussed how changing perceptions of these animals influence their archaeological interpretation as well as their conservation status and the contemporary knowledge held by indigenous populations. Jaguars have been understood in a way as frozen in time in archaeology, but they have either been conflated with universalized interpretations that are based on colonial imagination of all world big cats, or their understanding is based on ethnographic sources that are outdated. In these reconstructions, contemporary perceptions of jaguars are disregarded, misrepresented, or portrayed in a romanticized way. So as the case of the Mayans and the Aztecs and other countless groups, jaguars are not mere animals, they are embedded in all aspects of human lifeways, and as such, they are strong symbols. They have implications on how we approach, for example, ecology, culture, and identity today. So only recently, these new approaches have been emerging in the discipline, and researchers have been more open to exploring different epistemologies and ontologies. And this is slowly permeating into archaeology in the area as well. So a decolonial critique of animal studies must focus instead on a rejection of nature-culture dichotomies that perpetuates an exploitative relationship between animals and humans, and is instead conceived as a movement towards subversive indigenous and local knowledge of animals. So to conclude, decoloniality is gained through performance and interaction, following the work of Parad, for example. So it's a way, it's a movement within and a way of working with, also following the work of Sandberg. So as we have seen, decolonizing jaguars entails conceptualizing them as a way of being, as action or jaguaring. Through the acceptance of these relationships, a decolonizing practice within archaeology can be realized. And to conclude my presentation, I'm sorry, I'm going to do some shameless self-promotion, but with Andrew Jones, we're about to publish a book titled Sensing Multispecies Encounters. And the book is a collection of 8 different chapters, and also the introduction where we engage with different ideas of multispecies aesthetics, and we argue if we can actually conceive of multispecies aesthetics or not, and what are the implications for the humanities. So the different chapters engage with different methodological and theoretical challenges within multispecies studies. So this is going to be published in August. So if you're interested in this, you can contact me. And thank you so much. I would like to, first of all, thank Andrew Skinner for inviting me, and Fernando Tortato, Pantera, and also Rafael Chiarabalotti for their collaborations in the Pantanal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was wonderful. Do we have any questions? We have a few minutes left of the session. Anyone have any questions? Please put up your hand. Dawn, go ahead.
Hi, Anna. Thanks so much for that. It was a very interesting presentation, and it aptly covers something that we were grappling with at a recent conference of the relevance of archaeology to our publics and policymakers. I am particularly interested in the jaguar remains or paraphernalia found in excavated contexts. Can you speak a little bit to that?
I'm sorry, the last part of your question was cut.
Okay, can you hear me? I'm interested in from what jaguar remains or jaguar paraphernalia you have found in excavations or have been found in excavations, and what that can tell you about relationships.
Yes, thank you. So there's a lot of different elements on that. In the Brazilian Pantanal, the oldest evidence, it's about 3,000 years old, and that's related to these different mounds, and only fangs or jaguar teeth have been found. But interestingly enough, work done by Mariano Bonomo in this area also noted that where these places, these mounds are currently being used also by jaguars as areas. But in South America in general, there's a lot of different material remains. From a faunal point of view, they found mandibles, they found mostly teeth. The oldest one being the one in Schulze Cave, as I mentioned, but there's a lot of art objects and different material culture relating to jaguars. For example, in terms of ceramic remains, there's a lot of representations of shamans transforming into jaguars, for example, as in northern Argentina. There's a lot of pendants made of different elements. There's a lot of statuettes. There's jaguars in rock art representations, in murals, but from across different temporalities. So from 4,000 years old is the oldest rock art representation of jaguars up to the present. There's a wide diversity of remains and different ways of representing. So at the moment, what I'm trying to understand is how jaguars are conceptualized differently. First of all, in different material cultures, but also across regions. So there's differences between Mesoamerica, the Andes, and the Amazonia in the way they conceptualize jaguar bodies, but also the relationship between humans.
Thank you, Dawn. Does anyone else have any questions? Sam?
Yes, thank you very, very much for that presentation. I wondered, just on your last point there, when you were responding to Dawn, whether you might be able to expand just a little bit on those different conceptions of jaguars across space and even through time. I know that's an enormous thing, but just to give us maybe an idea.
Yes, one of the main differences is the way jaguars are conceptualized, for example, in the Andes and Amazonia. So in Amazonia, jaguars are mostly related, I mean, generally speaking, to naturalistic behaviors. Jaguars in both cases are associated to shamans, for example, but in Amazonia, animistic ontologies are mostly prevalent, whereas in the Andes, there's what's interesting to note is that jaguars are not physically present in the Andes. They were either brought over by human populations as dead animals, or perhaps even could be confined. There's a lot of representations of jaguars wearing leashes, for example, as I shown in one of the images. But it's unclear now how jaguars reached the area, if it was through oral knowledge of jaguars, and then they began representing jaguar bodies based on these oral accounts, or if they actually brought physical specimens or jaguars to the region. So that's something I'm trying to develop in a new project, in comparing these two areas, the Andes and Amazonia. And also, I mean, there's a lot of differences, but also a lot of commonalities. So in the Andes, it's mostly symbolic representations of jaguars across different material culture and paraphernalia, whereas in the Amazonia, is related a lot to ontological knowledge of the world. So there's a lot of taboos related to jaguars on not eating their meat, for example. But on the other hand, they use their blood for a lot of ceremonies.
Thank you, Sam. Anyone else?
Thank you very much.
Cool. Well, then I have a question quickly, just about the anthropology. So you mentioned that there's been a kind of like a loss of knowledge on how to engage with jaguars that maybe is a little bit more long term. and that's characterized human jaguar relations in the present period as being on kind of a negative trajectory. Would you mind giving us a sense of just, because I realize there's not necessarily a lot of continuity because of colonialism and these transformations, but in terms of what models of sort of good human-animal relations or human-jaguar relations specifically looked like, maybe in the ethnographic domains that are available. What do maybe like positive relations look like in these contexts?
Yes, thank you. That's yeah, all of the questions have been really interesting. I think in that sense, obviously South America and Latin America is a big continent. So I realized that for my presentation for these purposes, obviously you have to kind of solidify or present an image, but obviously different peoples across the continent consider jaguars very differently. So something that I mentioned was this view of jaguars, for example, specifically Mesoamerica, in the Aztec and Mayan populations, in which one tends to see or have this perception of animals or human-animal engagements as being harmonious, but it was not the case. For example, a lot of jaguar populations were extinct from a lot of different regions, and as I mentioned, they recolonized these areas after the European colonization and the extinction of 80% of indigenous populations. So while obviously there's a continuation of practices still to present day, this changed through time though, because there's been incorporation, for example, in the case of Pantanal, that the indigenous populations called ribereños, they're a combination of African slave people, European colonizers, and also local Wato people. So it's interesting to see how they all conflate and they recreate different ideas about jaguars. But I will say that in general, jaguars were seen as pushing the boundaries of nature and culture, and they were venerated. In lots of places, there were taboos about them being hunted. Or, in other places, in Brazil, they were particularly hunted for different ceremonies, especially in young men to become adults. Or yeah, so I wouldn't say it's uniform across the continent, but it's interesting to see how in indigenous discourses, there's always, for me, a balance between conservation and not overhunting of certain species because they preserve the environment. But colonization, what brought over was, as I say, the demonization of jaguars. So they were no longer venerated in some regions, and they began to be seen as a threat to human lifeways, for example, seen as animals that hunt and kill humans non-stop. Yes.
Go ahead, Sam.
Thanks again. I don't want to preoccupy the conversation. I just had a question, unless anyone else has got another question. No? You were touching there on the tricky subject of contemporaneous ethnographies as opposed to pushing these back in time a little bit. I mean, you didn't say it outright, but I was sort of reading between the lines, relational ontologies going back in time a little bit. And I wondered what your take was on, just as an example, the work by Jose Iriarte and Hampson et al. At Serena de la Lindosa, and how you rate it and how you compare the work that you're doing against that, because obviously you have imagery of jaguars there, and you have contemporary ethnography that seems to apply to it, that archaeologists have been routinely, well, not exactly ignoring, but just not doing. And Jamie Hampson and others went into this area and started talking to locals, and they fairly quickly discovered that a lot of the local peoples of many different cultural backgrounds had quite a lot to say about this place. Yeah, I wondered, I can see you nodding, so I wondered if you had anything to say about that.
Yes, of course. I particularly enjoy the work produced by Iriarte and Jamie Hampson. I actually visited La Lindosa 2 years ago, and it was my intention to work with them on particularly jaguars, because they have these representations in the rock art record, which is amazing, that goes back to 12,000 years old, based on identification of extinct megafauna. So, I mean, that's another topic in itself. But yes, I find it really interesting how they went into this place. They started doing interviews with local Colonos residents in the area that were displaced during different periods of the area, because it was under the I don't know how not to simplify, but there's a lot of conflict nowadays in the area. But basically, they did a lot of interviews, and yeah, they found there's more profound relationships between animals and the rock art of the area as well. So I find that very interesting. Obviously, one needs to be very cautious, especially when you're talking about rock art that is that goes back in time 12,000 years ago. And I have the same problem during my PhD when working with these early naturalistic depictions of animals. So while ethnographic theory is very useful in a way to rethink how humans and animals could have engaged with each other in the past, obviously it's not a mirror, it's not a time traveling machine. But it's interesting to recognize how these relationships could have looked like in the past as well. So in this case, I really enjoy their work, but it opens a lot of challenges on how to do that in a nuanced way and also in an ethical way, which I think they have been doing really well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 3 minutes left. Does anyone else have anything to ask? Sam, persistent today.
Sorry, Anna. Just in case no one else had a question, we got 3 minutes, so it's not very long. But about the book, Andrew, to my knowledge, doesn't necessarily work with contemporaneous anthropology or ethnographies, and so I wondered what you might have to say about what his contribution is to the book in terms of applying these concepts of relational ontologies that several of us are working on, Andrew and myself included, and I see John Parkington there as well, to art or archaeology in these places that I would more associate with Andrew Marion Jones, where we don't have those these fantastic ethnographies.
Yes, actually, Andy is working quite extensively in Canada with different Indigenous collaborators from the area. So they started this work during the pandemic, but the introduction is mostly engaged with anthropological discussions on multispecies studies, particularly the work by Howard Murphy and Deborah Verrose and Alfred Gell. So yes, it's mostly discussing, it's not that much focus on archaeological work. It's mostly how multi-species aesthetics have been conceived in anthropology, and we discuss if we can actually talk about multi-species aesthetics or not, which we think we cannot actually say that, and how different ideas of beauty and art have permeated into multi-species studies. And we have different chapters that engage, for example, from different disciplines. We have people working in museum contexts, people from environmental humanities, from history, and from arts that engage with animals in different ways. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily related to, I mean, we for example, I have my chapter working on conceptualization of kangaroo depictions in Australia from different perspectives. And then we have another contribution by North American artist that works with earthworks, for example. But yeah, Andy has also worked on that. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, then I think that's all for today. Thank you very much, Anna, for speaking with us today, and thank you all for coming. We do always appreciate it. Keep
Thank you
well,
so much.
and
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Hi, Andrew.